Hey there, and welcome. If you're here, you probably love history told slowly. Stories that make you curious, maybe a little odd, but calm enough to help you drift into sleep. Tonight, we're going far back, to a year so mysterious, so grim, that historians once called it the beginning of the Darkest Age. The year is 536 AD. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun hasn't risen properly. The world outside isn't bright gold or blue. Instead, everything looks gray, not from clouds, but from something thicker, heavier, almost like dust hanging in the air. You step outside and it feels wrong. The light is weak, the air is cold, and the sky stays dim all day long. Birds seem confused. Crops don't grow. And as weeks pass, you start to understand something truly frightening. This isn't just bad weather. Something much bigger has happened. This is the story of the year the sun disappeared. No one at the time could have explained it, of course. People didn't have satellites or science or the words to describe volcanic ash and climate collapse. But all across the world, people noticed. In Constantinople, a historian named Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. In Ireland, monks recorded a failure of bread. In China, summer snow fell and crops froze before they could ripen. And in the lands of Scandinavia, entire villages vanished into hunger and silence. The mystery of what caused it lasted for centuries, until modern scientists, centuries later, discovered the truth buried deep in ice. But before we get there, imagine what it must have felt like to live through it. In a time when people believed the heavens ruled everything, when eclipses were omens, and strange skies meant the gods were angry, the endless twilight must have felt like the end of the world. The year 536 wasn't just one bad year. It was the beginning of a chain of disasters that would echo for decades. Famine, plague, collapse. Yet, in that darkness, there were also sparks of survival. People who kept going, even when the world seemed frozen in dusk. So, tonight, as you settle in, let's go back to that lost year, and gently unfold what really happened, who lived through it, and how humanity endured one of its coldest, darkest chapters. People in the great cities of the Roman Empire, what was left of it, noticed first. Merchants along the trade routes said the sun had turned as blue as steel. In fields across Europe, farmers looked up and couldn't tell what time of day it was. The light felt wrong. Pale, sickly, almost metallic. At first, they thought it might be dust storms or smoke from distant fires. But the dimness didn't go away. Days stretched into weeks, and still the sun glowed weakly behind a veil of gray. The temperature dropped. Summer felt like winter. In some places, frost clung to the ground in June. Lakes froze early. Crops withered before they could ripen. The harvest failed, not once, but year after year. We know now what they didn't. A massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or maybe in North America, had sent billions of tons of ash into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight around the globe. But, to the people then, it must have felt like punishment. In small villages, rumors spread faster than truth. Some said demons had eaten the sun. Others believed the end times had begun. Priests called for prayers, sacrifices, anything that might bring back the light. And yet, the darkness stayed. In Constantinople, Procopius wrote that the sun shone like the moon for the whole year. Imagine how haunting that must have been, to wake each day in a world that never brightened, to live in a half-light that felt neither day nor night. Without sunlight, the world grew colder and quieter. Birds migrated early. Animals starved. People burned whatever they could to stay warm. Wood, furniture, even old homes left behind. The smoke only made the skies thicker. Hunger followed. In the northern lands, people began to leave their villages in search of food. Some fled south, following rivers and trade routes, while others vanished into the forests. The weak didn't make it far, and then came disease. The cold, the hunger, the exhaustion. It all opened the door for illness. In the years that followed, one of the deadliest plagues in human history would spread, the plague of Justinian. But even before that, entire families fell sick from starvation and despair. Still, not everyone gave up. People are resilient, even in the worst of times. Communities found ways to share what little they had. Hunters searched frozen forests for anything edible. Mothers told stories to keep their children calm through the long gray days. And somewhere in the silence, a fragile hope survived. Because even though the world had dimmed, humanity refused to disappear with it. That's how the year 536 began. Not with a bang, but with a whisper, a fading light, and a world holding its breath under a shroud of ash. Imagine standing in a world where the sky never clears. The sun still rises, but its light feels weak, like a candle behind fog. The air tastes faintly of dust. Shadows seem strange, stretched, and colorless. People squint at midday and wonder if it's still morning. That was life in 536 AD, a year when the sky itself changed. No one back then knew what had caused it. They didn't have telescopes or satellites, no weather forecasts or scientific instruments. To them, the world was alive, a breathing, feeling thing. If the sun dimmed, it was because something had angered the heavens. And so, across continents, people prayed. In Rome, priests offered incense to the old gods. In Constantinople, churches filled with frightened voices begging for mercy. In the far north, tribes gathered around bonfires, singing to spirits of light, asking them to return. But the light didn't come back. For more than a year, the earth remained wrapped in shadow. Temperatures dropped everywhere. Crops failed in Ireland, China, and across the Byzantine Empire. People wrote about a year without summer. It wasn't just dark, it was cold. Now, centuries later, scientists have pieced together the clues. The truth, like most of nature's mysteries, was hidden beneath our feet, locked in the ancient ice of Greenland and Antarctica. When researchers drilled deep into those frozen layers, they found something extraordinary. Thin bands of volcanic glass and sulfur trapped in ice from the exact year 536. That glass told a story no one had known for more than 1,000 years. Somewhere on Earth, a massive volcano had erupted, so violently that it sent ash and chemicals high into the stratosphere, where they stayed suspended for months, maybe even years. This ash didn't fall like normal soot. It drifted, invisible but powerful, spreading around the planet, blocking the sun's rays. It reflected sunlight back into space and cooled the earth below. That's why the air grew colder, the skies dimmer, and the harvests weaker. But what volcano could have done this? For a long time, no one was sure. Some thought it came from Iceland. Its eruptions could easily spread ash over Europe. Others believed it might have been in Central America or Indonesia, where enormous volcanoes can change the climate of the entire world. Some scientists even think there were two eruptions, one after another in 536 and again in 540, keeping the planet in a deep chill for nearly a decade. No matter where it began, the result was the same. The sky turned to ash and the earth fell into shadow. Ancient witnesses didn't have the words volcanic eruption, or aerosols, or climate event. They only had what they could see and feel. A Chinese chronicle from that year wrote of yellow dust falling from the sky. In Europe, the chronicler said the sun had lost its warmth. People felt a strange dry chill in the air, something not quite winter, but not life-giving spring either. The light that filtered through the ash changed how the world looked. Colors seemed duller. The ocean, once blue, turned gray-green. Trees cast faint ghost-like shadows. The moon glowed red at night, dimmed by the same haze that blocked the sun. And this went on not for days, but for months, for seasons, until people forgot what normal light looked like. Imagine that for a moment. A child born during this time would grow up never seeing a true summer. Their world would be one of cold mornings and gray afternoons, of pale harvests and thin warmth. For them, darkness wasn't something to fear. It was simply life. Yet humanity endured. Even in this ash-covered world, people adapted. Farmers tried new methods, storing what little grain they could, planting hardy roots instead of tender crops. Fishermen spent longer at sea, chasing food that didn't depend on the soil. Travelers carried torches through foggy roads, bringing news and hope to villages that hadn't seen sunlight in months. Some communities even grew closer through hardship. Shared fires, shared meals, shared prayers, all became a way to remind each other they weren't alone. In the ice today, we can still read their story, layer upon layer of frozen evidence, each one a silent page in Earth's diary. Scientists can even tell how cold it got. Average temperatures across Europe dropped by more than 2 degrees Celsius, enough to cause chaos in farming and food supply. The climate shock didn't end in a single year. It lingered. Crops failed again in 537, and again in 538. Famine spread. In some regions, forests took over abandoned fields. The great cities of the ancient world, once full of life and trade, grew quieter. Empires weakened. The balance of the world shifted, all because of a sky filled with ash. But nature, like history, moves in cycles. The ash slowly thinned. Winds carried it higher and farther, until little by little the light returned. The sun began to burn through the haze again, pale at first, then golden. And for those who had survived, that first clear morning must have felt like a miracle. To them, it wasn't just sunlight. It was hope made visible. But the damage was done. The famine had changed societies, weakened kingdoms, and made the world vulnerable to something even more terrifying that was yet to come. The great plague that would sweep through in the years that followed. The darkness had passed, but its shadow still lingered in the hearts of the people. And as they rebuilt their lives, they must have wondered, what had they done to anger the heavens? Or was the earth itself trying to start over? The ash may have lifted, but the age of suffering was far from over. Imagine waking up in June, expecting warmth, the sound of birds, the feel of sunlight on your skin, but instead you step outside into a chill wind. Your breath hangs in the air, frost coats the grass, the trees are bare, and the fields that should be green are still gray and lifeless. That was what life felt like in the year 536, and in the years that followed. What should have been summer was something else entirely. A cold, strange season without warmth, without light, without growth. People all over the world noticed the same thing. In Europe, farmers watched their crops fail again and again. Wheat refused to grow, and barley rotted before harvest. In Ireland, monks wrote that bread failed from the years 536 to 539. In China, snow fell in midsummer, and rivers froze long before autumn. Even in the Middle East, a land known for its heat, the skies turned dim and cold. No one could escape it. The world had entered what scientists today call a volcanic winter. The ash and sulfur in the air reflected sunlight back into space, turning the sky into a dull gray filter that cooled the planet. But for those living through it, there was no such explanation, only confusion, fear, and hunger. Villagers prayed for the sun to return. Priests tried rituals, processions, anything that might end the endless twilight. Some believed the apocalypse had come. Others thought it was punishment, that somewhere, somehow, humanity had offended the gods. In small towns, people grew desperate. Food became more precious than gold. A handful of grain could mean life or death. Those with livestock traded them away for scraps of bread. Even the strong began to grow weak. The young grew silent. Imagine entire communities shrinking inward as the world outside turned hostile. Fires burning low, families huddled together, each day blending into the next. The cold seeped through walls, through clothing, through hope itself. And yet, even in all this suffering, life didn't stop. People adapted. Humans always do. They gathered roots from frozen ground, hunted what few animals remained, and learned to stretch what little they had. In some places, they shared their last food with neighbors. In others, they migrated south, searching for warmth that didn't exist anymore. But this wasn't a short event. The world stayed in this half-frozen state for years. In the Byzantine Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the time, Emperor Justinian Gre's grand plans for expansion began to crumble. Armies couldn't march on empty stomachs. Trade slowed. The great cities, filled with marble and gold, grew quieter as hunger spread even within their walls. Far to the north, in Scandinavia, whole settlements vanished. Archaeologists believe that many of the early farms were simply abandoned, their people gone, their homes left to rot. In Ireland and Scotland, the population dropped dramatically. It was as if the land itself had exhaled and emptied. The ash in the sky didn't just block sunlight. It changed how rain fell, how rivers flowed, how crops grew. It disturbed the very rhythm of nature. Trees grew more slowly, and their rings tell us today exactly how severe those years were. Thin, stunted lines of growth marking the time when even forests struggled to live. The temperature drop was only a few degrees, but in a world without modern heating, without electricity, without global trade, those few degrees meant everything. Cold meant hunger. Hunger meant disease. And disease was already waiting. When people are weak, when food is scarce and movement slows, illness spreads easily, and only a few years after the sun dimmed, another disaster followed, one that would take millions of lives, the plague of Justinian. But that part of the story would come later. For now, the world was locked in a long, pale nightmare, a season that would not end. And yet, not everyone saw only despair. Some chroniclers wrote about how communities came together in those times. Families shared warmth, stories, and faith. People learned to find beauty in survival, in the way the frost sparkled on rooftops, in the quiet of snow falling where summer fields once bloomed. Even the sky, though dim, had its strange kind of beauty. When the sun did appear, it was hazy and soft, casting a gentle golden gray light. The moon glowed orange through the ash. To those who looked up, it might have felt like living inside a dream, or perhaps a memory, half forgotten but still beautiful. Historians today call it the year without summer, but for the people back then it was more than that. It was a test of endurance, of kindness, of faith. It was a time when humans learned how fragile life could be, and how strong they could become when faced with the unknown. Eventually, the sky began to clear, little by little. The light grew stronger. The winds carried the ash away. Crops began to grow again, though slowly, and people dared to hope that the worst was over. But history rarely gives rest so easily. The famine had weakened them. The cold had thinned their numbers, and the earth, wounded by years of ash and frost, was not yet done changing. Still, for one brief moment, after all that darkness, the return of sunlight must have felt like a miracle. People would have stepped outside, felt the faint warmth on their skin, and smiled. A small, quiet victory after years of survival. Because that's what history is, really. Not just a story of great kings and battles, but of ordinary people who kept going, even when the world itself seemed to stop. And so, the year without summer passed into memory, whispered in stories, written in old books and buried in the rings of trees. But its shadow would linger for centuries, in hunger, in fear, and in the cold lessons it left behind. When the skies refused to clear and the harvests continued to fail, the true weight of the disaster began to settle across the world. What started as a strange dimming of sunlight turned into something much harder, something everyone could feel. Hunger. At first, people hoped it was just a bad season. Crops had failed before. There had been floods and droughts and even cold spells that tested farmers' strength. But as 1 year became 2 and 2 stretched into 3, hope began to thin, like the smoke from fires burning out too soon. In small villages, families opened their granaries and counted every kernel. They stretched what they had, grinding old grain with bark, mixing flour with crushed roots or weeds. Bread became bitter but necessary. Children were fed first, the old gave up their share. In cities, markets grew silent. The smell of baked bread, once comforting, vanished entirely. The famine didn't come all at once, but like a slow tide, creeping into every home. Livestock died first. There was no grass for them to eat, no feed to keep them alive through the endless cold. Without animals, there was no milk, no wool, no meat. People began to eat what they could find: bark from trees, boiled leather, even grass. In Ireland, ancient annals spoke of people so desperate they fled their villages entirely, wandering through the mist in search of food. In China, poems from the time mention snow in summer and empty fields where nothing grew. Across the Byzantine Empire, famine became so widespread that even soldiers, once strong, disciplined men, grew weak from hunger. Imagine it, the constant ache of emptiness, the quiet despair of waking up knowing there would be no meal that day, and probably not the next. The body weakens, but the mind does too. People stop talking, moving, hoping. The world becomes very small. Just the next day, the next breath. And yet, even in this darkness there were flickers of light, small acts of kindness, the stubbornness of survival. In some regions, neighbors shared what little they had. Priests and monks opened storehouses meant for the church and gave away their supplies. In Constantinople, records show that the emperor tried to import grain from faraway lands, though even those ships struggled to reach port through icy seas and ash-filled skies. It's strange to think about now, but the famine reshaped entire societies. When food disappears, so does stability. Leaders lose power, people migrate, and the balance between rich and poor changes overnight. The powerful could still eat, of course. They had stored grain, land, and servants to fetch whatever remained, but even they couldn't escape the cold. Their gardens withered. Their cattle died, and when the people grew restless, even the wealthy hid behind walls, fearing revolt. In the north, especially in Scandinavia, entire settlements simply vanished. Archaeologists have found layers of ash and empty homes, places that were suddenly abandoned during the late 530s. It's likely that whole families packed what little they owned and walked south, hoping to find land where crops still grew. Most never made it. The famine wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. When the world changes without warning, people begin to question everything: their faith, their leaders, even their gods. Across Europe, whispers began that the end of days had come. In churches, priests spoke of punishment and repentance. In the far corners of the pagan world, sacrifices returned, desperate offerings to forgotten deities asking for mercy. And yet, in the middle of all that fear, something unexpected happened: a strange unity. Hunger didn't care about borders or beliefs. It humbled everyone: king, farmer, soldier, monk. The same sky hung above them all, gray and cold, without sunlight or warmth. By 538, small changes began to appear. The skies lightened just a little. Some crops began to sprout again. People whispered that the worst might finally be ending. But after years of hunger, many had already been lost. The old and the young were gone first. Villages had fewer voices. Songs grew softer, less certain, and the famine had left scars deeper than the body. When food became available again, people didn't celebrate loudly. They ate quietly, carefully, remembering what it meant to go without. Grain was stored instead of spent. Bread was shared, never wasted. Even generations later, stories of those cold, hungry years were told by firelight. Warnings whispered to children about how fragile life could be. Scientists today can still see traces of that suffering written into the earth. Ice cores show chemical signatures of dust and sulfur from the eruption that caused the famine. Tree rings from those years are so narrow that they almost disappear, and in layers of soil across Europe, there's a faint line of volcanic ash, a reminder that even the sky can betray the living world below. But for the people who endured it, science wasn't the answer. The only truth they knew was that winter had conquered summer, and the sun had gone cold. And still, somehow humanity endured. Through famine, through fear, through years of gray skies, people kept each other alive, by sharing warmth, by sharing hope, by refusing to give up. And when the first spring finally returned, it wasn't just the earth that began to thaw, it was the human spirit. They had seen the world darken and still found their way through it. That was the quiet triumph of the famine years. Not victory, not glory, but survival. When the worst of the famine passed, the world did not return to what it had been. The ash had faded, yes, and sunlight once again touched the earth, but in many places there was no one left to see it. Whole villages were gone, their homes silent, their fields empty, their names forgotten. It's strange to think about how quickly a place can vanish. A settlement that once echoed with laughter, footsteps, and songs can disappear in just a few years. The roofs fall in, the fences rot, and nature, patient as always, takes it all back. The land swallows what it made. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have found traces of these lost communities. Villages that ended suddenly around 536 AD. Houses were left standing, but hearths went cold. Tools lay where they had been dropped. It's as if people walked out one day and never came back. No battle, no fire, no invasion. Just silence. The soil still tells their story. Beneath layers of moss and forest, scientists found pollen records showing how farmlands turned back into wilderness. Crops stopped growing, weeds returned, and trees reclaimed the fields. The people had abandoned the land because it could no longer feed them. In Britain and Ireland, too, ancient farmsteads disappeared. The chronicles speak of hunger, but they also speak of migration, of families leaving behind their stone huts and walking south, hoping to find sunlight and food. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did started new lives elsewhere, blending into other tribes, their old names lost forever. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the decline was slower but no less real. The great cities, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, still stood, glittering and powerful, but the countryside around them suffered. Fewer farmers meant fewer crops, fewer traders, fewer soldiers. The empire began to weaken from within. The seeds of collapse had been planted by ash. And yet the ruins left behind were not just scars. They were stories frozen in time. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the remains of those vanished villages, they found signs of everyday life. Clay pots, wooden spoons, fragments of woven cloth. The people who lived there had cooked, worked, and dreamed like anyone else. They had pets. They built cradles for their children. They carved simple decorations into their homes, all of it left behind when the cold came. Sometimes, when you stand among ruins, real ruins, quiet ones covered in moss, you can almost feel that memory. The air feels heavier, as if it remembers the sound of voices that are no longer there. That is the kind of silence the world carried after the year 536. Not an empty silence, but one filled with ghosts of the ordinary. In Scandinavia, the few who stayed turned to the forests. Hunting replaced farming. Communities became smaller, more cautious, moving with the seasons. In Ireland, the monks who kept their chronicles did so by candlelight, recording in neat handwriting the years when the bread failed. They didn't know they were writing history. They were just trying to remember. But in the ruins of those abandoned villages, something beautiful also happened. Nature came back. The same cold that drove people away gave the land time to heal. Forests grew thick again. Rivers ran clean. Deer and wolves returned. The earth, in its own way, was starting over. And perhaps that's part of the strange rhythm of history. Destruction and renewal, loss and rebirth. Every vanished village was a tragedy, but also a promise that life, one day, would return. People who lived through the famine years must have carried the memory of those empty places in their hearts. When they rebuilt, they built smaller homes. They stored more food. They taught their children to respect the land, because they knew what it meant when the earth turned against them. It's easy for us now to look at those lost villages as distant history, but for them, they were everything. Their world, their home, their identity. When they left, they weren't just walking away from hunger, they were leaving behind generations of memory, love, and life. And in the centuries that followed, as the ice melted and the forests grew back, the earth covered those memories gently, the way snow covers a field in winter. Quiet, complete, and eternal. Even now, when scientists dig deep into the soil and uncover traces of ash and bones, they are, in a way, listening to that silence again. Because history isn't gone. It's just sleeping. And somewhere beneath our feet, the lost villages of 536 still rest, wrapped in earth and time, waiting for the light of another dawn. After years of gray skies and silent fields, the world began to change. Slowly at first, so slowly that people barely noticed. But one morning, someone somewhere must have looked up and realized the sun seemed a little brighter than before. The haze that had blanketed the world for so long was finally beginning to thin. At first, people didn't trust it. The cold had lasted too long. The sky had betrayed them too many times. Even as the light grew stronger, farmers hesitated to plant. Families stayed cautious, waiting to see if the warmth would last. Hope, after all, was a dangerous thing. But the change was real. The winds that carried ash around the planet had finally shifted. The fine dust that hung in the atmosphere began to settle, falling quietly into oceans and forests. The air grew clearer. The light, soft, golden, and fragile, returned. For the first time in years, people could see blue in the sky again. The feeling must have been indescribable. Imagine stepping out of your home and seeing the sun shining with full strength, not the dim, ghostly glow of the past few years, but real sunlight. Warm, alive, and golden. For those who had survived, it must have felt like a miracle, like waking up from a long and terrible dream. In Constantinople, the great city by the sea, the markets began to open again. Farmers brought what little grain they had left. Fishermen returned to the harbors with their nets. Children ran in the streets. It wasn't prosperity, not yet, but it was life. In Europe's countryside, people started to rebuild. They cleared the weeds that had taken over their fields. They planted seeds again, even though their hands shook from weakness. And when the first shoots of green pushed through the dark earth, it must have felt like seeing light return to the world itself. For years, the sky had been a symbol of fear, the pale, endless gray of an angry heaven. Now it became a promise. Every sunrise meant another chance. But even in this fragile rebirth, the memory of darkness lingered. People didn't forget how easily it could vanish. They stored food carefully, built stronger shelters, and watched the horizon with wary eyes. The lessons of 536 had been burned too deeply into their souls to fade quickly. Still, nature began to heal faster than anyone could have imagined. Forests spread into abandoned lands. Rivers, once frozen and still, glittered in the sunlight. Birds returned. The rhythm of life began to hum again. Quiet at first, then steady, then joyful. Some believed that divine mercy had saved them. Others thought the earth had forgiven whatever wrong had caused the endless winter. The truth, of course, was simpler and stranger. The planet had merely balanced itself again. The ash had settled, and the sunlight had come home. But maybe there was a kind of mercy in that, too. It's easy to forget how deeply humans depend on the sun, not just for warmth, but for spirit. When the world is cold and gray for too long, even the strongest hearts begin to dim. But when light returns, even faintly, it sparks something ancient inside us, the will to begin again. In the decades that followed, new generations grew up who never knew the famine, who never saw the darkened sky. To them, the stories of 536 sounded like myths, tales of a time when the sun vanished and people walked under an eternal twilight. And maybe, in a way, it did become myth. The memory of what had happened turned into legend, whispered beside fires on winter nights. But traces of that age remained. In tree rings, in ice, in the ruins of the villages that never recovered. Nature remembers everything, even when people forget. Yet this time, the memory wasn't only about loss, it was also about endurance. Humanity had faced the coldest years in living memory and had survived. The sky had fallen dark, and still, people had kept their fires burning. When historians today study that time, they often call it a catastrophe. But if you look closely, you see something else too. Not just tragedy, but transformation. Out of that long night came a new resilience, a quiet understanding that no storm lasts forever. Perhaps that's why this moment in history still feels so human, because every one of us, in some way, knows what it's like to wait for the light to return. And in 539, when the first real summer came again, when the warmth spread across the earth and the harvests finally grew full, the people who had lived through it must have stood together and looked at the sunrise not with fear this time, but with awe. The world had gone dark, and yet it lived again. When the sun finally came back and warmth returned to the world, people believed the worst was over. The earth was green again. The air was clear. Crops began to grow. Animals grazed once more, and laughter, tentative at first, returned to villages and cities. For a brief moment, humanity breathed again. But nature, it seemed, had one more cruel test waiting. Not long after the long darkness ended, just a few short years later, another shadow began to spread. This time, it wasn't in the sky. It was among the people. The first whispers came from the east, from the ports along the Red Sea. Traders spoke of sickness aboard ships, strange fevers, swollen bodies, sudden deaths. At first, no one believed it. After all, people had always fallen ill. But this was different. By 541 AD, the disease reached the great city of Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. It began quietly. A few sailors fell sick, then dock workers, then the markets. Within weeks, the city changed. Streets emptied. Doors were bolted shut. The smell of smoke and decay filled the air. What came to be known as the Plague of Justinian would become one of the deadliest pandemics in all of human history. Imagine the fear. You wake up one morning and hear that your neighbor has died, not from hunger or cold, but from something no one understands. The next day, another falls ill. You start to feel a chill, then a burning heat. Buboes, painful swellings, rise beneath the skin. Some die within days, others within hours. And no one knows why. For the people of the 6th century, this was a world without science, without medicine as we know it. Illness was seen as a curse, a punishment, or a divine sign. Priests led processions, praying for mercy. Fires were lit in the streets to chase away the evil air. But nothing helped. The plague kept coming. In Constantinople alone, thousands died every day. Entire neighborhoods vanished. The emperor himself, Justinian, caught the disease but survived. Many saw that as a miracle. Others wondered if even miracles could save the empire from what was happening. Ships brought the plague across the Mediterranean, to Egypt, to Italy, to Gaul. Rats and fleas carried it silently from port to port, village to village. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, ruler or servant. The disease didn't choose. It simply spread. And just as the famine years had taught people fear of the sky, the plague taught them fear of one another. You could not see it, you could not fight it, you could only wait. Those who survived spoke of the silence that followed, a silence worse than the famine itself. The sound of carts carrying bodies to mass graves, the bells that rang endlessly, families torn apart, entire towns reduced to memory. It must have felt like the end of the world again. Historians believe the plague of Justinian may have killed up to half of Europe's population. It returned again and again over the next 2 centuries, striking whenever the world began to feel safe. It reshaped nations, ended dynasties, and changed history itself. But what makes this moment so haunting is that it came right after hope had begun to grow again. The people who had survived years of hunger and darkness finally saw the light return, only to be met by death itself. Still, even through that terror, life continued. Monks copied texts by candlelight. Farmers tilled the soil, though fewer now. Parents raised the children who had been spared. Empires weakened, but humanity endured. Because that's what humans do, even in the darkest of times. They adapt, they persist, and they remember. Today, when scientists study ancient graves from that time, they find traces of the plague, S. bacteria, Yersinia pestis, preserved in the teeth of long-dead victims. It's the same microbe that would later return centuries later as the Black Death. The same silent killer waiting in the shadows of history. And yet, it did not destroy the world completely. After the plague, people rebuilt again. Slower this time, wiser, perhaps more humble. They had seen how fragile everything was. Light, warmth, life itself. They no longer took it for granted. It's strange, but in the quiet after the plague, something beautiful also happened. The survivors began to look at life differently. Art and religion changed. Faith deepened. Gratitude grew. The smallest things, a sunrise, a shared meal, a child's laughter, became precious again. Because after so much loss, simply living became its own kind of miracle. The famine had tested their bodies. The plague tested their souls. But both, in their own terrible ways, taught humanity endurance, the kind that doesn't shout or conquer but simply waits, breathes, and continues. And as the world slowly healed again, one truth lingered in every heart, that even after the longest darkness, life finds a way back. Always. When the plague loosened its grip, the world that remained was not the same one that had existed before. It was thinner, quieter, and more fragile, like a great tapestry with many of its threads pulled loose. Cities still stood, but they no longer felt alive. Roads that once hummed with trade were empty. The fields around them were silent except for the wind. The Byzantine Empire, once the shining center of civilization, had survived the storm, but only barely. Emperor Justinian, scarred by both sickness and loss, returned to rebuilding his empire. He ordered new walls, new laws, and even new churches. The Hagia Sophia, with its vast golden dome, stood as proof that humanity could still create beauty after horror. But beneath the marble and gold, the empire was exhausted. Half the population was gone. Farmers who had worked the land were dead or too weak to continue. Soldiers who had once defended the borders were buried in plague pits. Trade collapsed. Without people to grow food, hunger returned in waves. Justinian tried to hold the empire together through sheer will, but his dream of restoring the old Roman glory was already slipping through his fingers. Beyond Constantinople, the rest of the Mediterranean world was breaking apart too. Italy had been ravaged by both war and disease. North Africa, once a rich province of the empire, fell into chaos. The great roads of Rome, once symbols of unity, were now cracked and overgrown. For centuries, the Roman Empire, in one form or another, had been the heart of the known world. Now, its pulse was faint. And in that fading heartbeat, the Middle Ages began. But this new world, though born from ruin, wasn't just dark, it was different. Smaller, simpler, more local. Power scattered like seeds in the wind. Kingdoms rose where empires had fallen. Villages became the new centers of life. People no longer looked to a distant emperor or an unseen city for salvation. They looked to their neighbors, their families, their faith. It's strange how loss can reshape everything. The very collapse that ended the old order also cleared the way for something new. Monasteries, those quiet places of prayer and learning, became the guardians of knowledge. Monks copied ancient texts by hand: Greek philosophy, Roman law, medical treatises, even poetry, preserving the wisdom of the past one letter at a time. The faint scratching of quills replaced the roar of cities. In the silence after empire, the seeds of future civilizations were being sown. But for the people living then, it must have felt like the end of the world. Imagine being born just after the famine and the plague, growing up among ruins and old stories. You would hear elders speak of a time when ships filled the harbors, when streets were bright with lamps, when the emperor's messengers rode across vast lands in a single week. And yet, all around you now was wilderness, forests reclaiming stone, wild animals roaming through broken courtyards. You might wonder if the world had somehow shrunk, and in a way, it had. Travel became dangerous. Bandits haunted the old Roman roads. With fewer people, isolation grew. Communities turned inward, building small defenses against both enemies and nature. But out of that isolation, new cultures began to take root. In the far north, small tribes learned to survive harsh winters with skill and patience. In the west, kings and queens began to rise, figures who would one day form the nations of Europe. In the east, Constantinople remained a flickering flame, a last reminder of what had once been. And all the while, the climate, still unsteady, kept shaping the story. Some years were kind, bringing full harvests. Others turned cold again, reminding everyone of how fragile life could be. The people who lived through this time didn't call it the Dark Ages. That name came later. To them, it was simply the world they knew. Broken, yes, but still alive. There's something almost beautiful about how they adapted. When trade networks failed, they bartered. When cities fell, they built villages. When rulers vanished, they turned to local leaders, priests, and elders. Humanity found new ways to organize itself, small, simple, and human. And slowly, light began to return. Not in the sky this time, but in the heart of civilization. By the late 6th century, art began to change. Music crept back into churches. Stories, legends, songs, and folk tales were passed down again. The human need for meaning, for beauty, for connection, had survived everything. Even amid ruin, people still painted. They still sang. They still loved. That is what makes this chapter of history so deeply human. We often think of it as a time of darkness, but perhaps it was more like the quiet before a sunrise, the long breath the world takes before the light returns. From the ashes of empire, a new Europe was being born, one that would, in time, give rise to kings, cathedrals, universities, and art. But none of that could have happened without the resilience of the people who came before, the ones who endured the cold, the hunger, and the silence, yet never stopped believing that life could continue. So, while the great empire faded, humanity endured, quietly building a new world from the bones of the old one. And perhaps that's the true story of the aftermath. Not just what was lost, but what was rebuilt, quietly, patiently, in the dark. Because even when the world breaks, people have always found a way to mend it. When the world finally steadied after years of hunger, plague, and ruin, those who had survived began to grow old. Their hair turned gray, their hands roughened from rebuilding what had been lost. They told stories to their children, stories about the sky that went dark, the crops that died, the days when the sun didn't rise. At first, those stories were warnings. Be grateful for the light, they said. Never forget how cold it can get. But as the decades passed, the meaning began to fade. Children listened with wide eyes but couldn't imagine a world without sunlight. To them, it sounded like a myth, something distant, impossible, almost magical. And just like that, memory turned into legend. These new generations were born into a quieter world. The great cities had shrunk, the empires had fractured, but the rhythms of daily life had returned. The fields grew green again. The rivers ran clear. Life had become small, but peaceful. Yet, in that peace, something else was lost, the connection to the vastness of the world that had once been. People no longer thought in terms of empires and trade routes. They thought in seasons and harvests, in families and villages. The silent generations, as we call them now, lived without knowing how extraordinary their survival truly was. They didn't see themselves as the heirs of a great catastrophe. They simply worked, married, prayed, and grew old. Their silence wasn't born from ignorance. It was born from weariness. After centuries of fear, quiet was all they wanted. But silence doesn't mean stillness. Beneath that calm surface, the world was slowly changing again. Forests had reclaimed much of the old Roman lands. Nature was wild and vast, filled with wolves, bears, and deer. The ruins of once great cities became homes for birds and foxes. Travelers would come across marble columns half buried in moss and wonder who had built them. They didn't know, and didn't need to. The world before them might as well have belonged to another species. But even as the old knowledge faded, small pockets of learning endured. In quiet monasteries scattered across the hills, monks and scholars copied what little survived of ancient wisdom. Each book was precious, handwritten, bound in leather, passed from one generation to the next. The act of copying became a kind of prayer, a way of keeping the flame alive in a world that had forgotten fire. Outside those stone walls, life was simpler but harsh. Winters were still cruel, and the memory of famine haunted every generation. People built their homes near water, near woods, near each other. Communities depended on cooperation. When the snows came, neighbors shared food. When someone fell sick, others helped bury the dead. There were no kings nearby to command, no armies to protect, only each other. In this way, humanity became humble again, and perhaps that humility was what saved them. Without grand empires or ambitions, people turned their focus to survival, to love, to the small joys of life, the warmth of a fire, the laughter of children, the beauty of a clear sky. For the first time in a long time, humanity was learning how to live with the earth again, not against it. But even in that quiet, the world still remembered. The scars of the dark year ran deep, in the soil, in the rings of trees, in the rhythm of the seasons. Every so often, a colder winter would come, and the stories would rise again. The elders would say, "It's happening like before, the year of no sun." And the young would shiver, not knowing whether to laugh or to believe. Generation by generation, the tale of 536 became both a warning and a comfort. It reminded people of how fragile life could be, but also how strong they were, because even in the face of disaster, the world hadn't ended. The silent generations carried that truth without realizing it. They didn't write it down or carve it in stone. They lived it. In their patience, in their endurance, in the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. And maybe that's why we call them silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had already said it, with the way they lived. In the centuries to come, those silent years would give rise to something unexpected. The small villages they built would grow into towns. The traditions they preserved would become cultures. The stories they told by firelight would become the myths that shaped Europe. From silence came a new voice. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful part of the story, that the future was born not from glory or conquest, but from quiet endurance. When we think of history, we often picture battles, kings, and empires. But sometimes the most important chapters are the ones without noise, the ones where people simply kept going. Because that's how humanity survives. not through brilliance or power, but through persistence. The silent generations may not have written their names in stone, but they kept the world turning long enough for others to begin again. And that, in its quiet way, is one of the greatest achievements of all. The world does not stay silent forever. Even the darkest soil, if given time, will bloom again. After generations of quiet endurance, the first signs of rebirth began to appear. It didn't happen suddenly, not with fanfare or great invention, but gently, like spring after a long, cruel winter. In small villages scattered across the old empire's bones, life began to organize itself in new ways. Families grew into communities. Communities formed alliances. Little by little, people started to dream again, not of survival, but of living. The land that had once been devastated by famine and plague now offered its gifts again. Farmers had learned from hardship. They saved seeds, rotated crops, and respected the rhythms of nature in ways their ancestors had ignored. Each harvest was still uncertain, but now it was met with gratitude rather than fear. And as food became more stable, so did everything else. The constant fear of hunger eased, allowing people to look beyond the next meal. They began to rebuild old roads, repair bridges, reopen trade routes that had been silent for decades. Merchants carried salt, wool, and stories between distant villages. For the first time in generations, news began to travel again. It wasn't yet the bustling world of Rome or Byzantium, but it was movement. Small, steady, human. Where there is trade, there is exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas. Travelers brought tales from faraway lands, stories of forgotten gods and distant kings. Songs changed as they passed from one valley to another, slowly weaving together new cultures out of the remnants of the old. The people who lived then would never have thought of themselves as part of a rebirth. To them, it was just life. Mending, building, growing. But looking back, we can see the first faint sparks of something extraordinary. In the north, tribes that had once been nomadic began to settle. They built wooden halls and carved symbols into stone. In the west, new kingdoms emerged, small and fragile but determined. And in the east, Constantinople, weary but unbroken, remained a lone beacon of continuity, still guarding what was left of the ancient world's knowledge. Meanwhile, deep in monasteries and scriptoria, the quiet work continued. Monks bent over parchment by candlelight, copying texts that had survived the centuries. Their ink-stained hands preserved words that might otherwise have been lost forever. Philosophy, science, poetry, prayers. Each page they finished was an act of defiance against forgetfulness. You can almost imagine the stillness of those rooms, the soft scratch of quills, the scent of wax and dust, the flicker of candlelight reflecting off gold leaf letters. In the silence of a world still recovering, the written word became a heartbeat, faint but steady. Elsewhere, new art began to appear, not the grand marble statues of Rome, but carvings on wood, tapestries woven with stories of saints, of miracles, of the earth itself. The art of survival was turning slowly into the art of hope, and beneath it all, the natural world was healing too. Forests grew thick again, rivers cut new paths, and animals returned to lands they had once abandoned. The climate, though still unpredictable, began to settle. The great veil of ash that had once dimmed the sun was long gone, and with it came warmer seasons and longer days. For those living through it, this was not an age of glory, but of patience. They were not inventing great empires or discovering new continents. They were rebuilding the foundation of life itself. That might sound small, but it was everything. Because before there can be greatness, there must first be stability. Before innovation, there must be trust. Before light, there must be the courage to believe the darkness has passed. It's easy to look back and call it a rebirth, but in truth, it was a slow and fragile awakening. Every harvest, every book copied, every road repaired was a small act of hope. the kind that doesn't make history books but changes history all the same. And this was the true beginning of what would one day become the medieval world. A strange, beautiful fusion of old and new, of Roman memory and northern myth, of faith and fear, of silence and song. The people of this era had no idea that centuries later, their patience would be seen as the soil from which entire civilizations would grow. They simply did what humans always do when the world has broken them. They began again. Maybe that's the most powerful part of the story, that progress doesn't always roar forward. Sometimes it takes a deep breath first. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it just waits, quietly in the hands of those who plant seeds they'll never live to see bloom. And as those seeds took root across the continents, something unseen but unstoppable began. A pulse, faint at first, but growing stronger. The long night of the 6th century was finally giving way to dawn. The world was learning how to hope again. After centuries of hardship and silence, something began to change in the air. It wasn't loud or sudden. It came softly, like the way dawn creeps across the horizon, almost unnoticed at first, until the world is bright again. The people of this new age didn't realize it, but they were living through the slow return of light. Not just the sunlight that once dimmed in the dark year, but the light of knowledge, creativity, and connection. It started in the simplest of ways. Farmers noticed that the seasons were more predictable now. The earth yielded more crops. Winters, though still cold, no longer felt endless. This stability gave birth to confidence, and confidence led to curiosity. When people have enough to eat, their minds start to wander. They ask questions, they seek meaning, they create. The villages that had once been isolated began to grow. Small markets appeared again. Bells rang from churches rebuilt on the ruins of older temples. Music returned to daily life. Flutes carved from bone, drums stretched with hide, songs sung in fields during the harvest. After centuries of fear, the sound of laughter became a miracle. But light returned in other ways, too. In monasteries across Europe, monks who had once been focused only on prayer began to study the world around them. They recorded the stars, mapped the seasons, and preserved ideas that had been forgotten. Their quiet work planted the seeds for future science, philosophy, and art. In places like Ireland, far from the ruins of Rome, monks copied not only holy texts but also stories, old Celtic myths, poems, and local legends. They blended faith and folklore, reason and wonder. Out of that fusion, a new way of seeing the world began to emerge, one where the divine was not just in heaven, but in the earth, the trees, and the rhythm of life itself. Trade routes began to reopen, connecting distant corners of the world once more. Along with spices, silk, and salt came new ideas, new faiths, new technologies, new dreams. In Constantinople, scholars still guarded the treasures of ancient Greece and Rome. Their libraries held the wisdom of centuries, waiting for the right time to spread again. That time was coming. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims carried bits of that knowledge westward, piece by piece, word by word. And in that slow movement of thought and story, something remarkable happened. Humanity began to remember itself. The great civilizations of old had been built on ambition, on conquering, expanding, proving power. But this new light was gentler. It came from patience, from survival, from the quiet conviction that life was worth rebuilding even after everything had been lost. You can almost imagine what it must have felt like, to wake up one morning and realize that the world wasn't as harsh as it once seemed, to see green in the fields again, to hear the chatter of travelers on the road, to feel warmth on your face and know that spring had returned, to live in an age where the sky had once gone dark and now, finally, it was blue again. And yet, the memory of that darkness never truly vanished. It lived in old songs and whispered prayers, in tales told beside fires when the wind howled outside. It was a reminder of how fragile the world could be, and how precious light truly was. That memory made people humble, but it also made them strong. They had seen how quickly life could vanish, so they cherished what they had all the more. The 6th century's children had become the 7th century's dreamers, builders, storytellers, and thinkers. From the edges of despair, a new age of possibility was beginning to rise. It wouldn't be fast. It would take hundreds of years for the full glow of civilization to return. But the spark was there, faint but steady, like a candle in the dark that refused to go out. The world had survived its coldest, darkest hour. Now it was learning to live again. And perhaps that is the truest light of all, not the one that shines brightest, but the one that endures. By the time the 7th century settled in, the earth felt different, calmer, warmer, and alive in a way it hadn't been for generations. The scars of famine and plague were still there, written in forgotten villages and quiet graves, but life was blooming again over the wounds of history. In every corner of the old world, people were beginning to build anew. The sound of hammers echoed where silence had once reigned. Smoke rose gently from the chimneys of new homes. After centuries of uncertainty, there was finally rhythm again. The rhythm of work, of seasons, of hope. Farmers who had once fought to survive each winter now began to think ahead, planting orchards, keeping herds, trading extra grain with neighbors. Children played where once there had been hunger. The laughter of life had returned, soft and fragile but real. Human beings have an incredible instinct to rebuild, no matter how many times the world breaks. That instinct was shaping this new era in quiet but powerful ways. The great empires were gone, but in their place rose something more human-scaled. Kingdoms, clans, and tribes each built their own systems of order. People no longer looked to distant emperors for salvation. They found strength in their communities, in family, in shared belief. And from this smaller, steadier world came something new: identity. People began to think of themselves not as subjects of a vast empire, but as part of a region, a people, a culture. From the ashes of Rome grew the roots of nations that would one day define Europe, England, France, Spain, and others still unborn. But before those names meant anything, they were simply places where people lived, worked, and told stories. And those stories were what truly rebirthed the world. As trade routes reopened, tales traveled alongside goods. Tales of saints and miracles, of gods and heroes, of beasts that lived in the forests and spirits that guarded the mountains. Old myths blended with new faiths, weaving a tapestry of imagination that gave people meaning after centuries of silence. In the monasteries, monks continued their quiet work, writing not only religious texts but chronicles of the age. They recorded floods, eclipses, births, and wars. Without realizing it, they were preserving the heartbeat of a reborn civilization. Their ink and parchment became time machines, carrying the memory of the world forward. Meanwhile, across the sea, in the deserts and cities of the East, other civilizations were rising too. Knowledge long kept in Persia, India, and Arabia began to spread again, moving westward like a sunrise. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy. All of these ancient lights would soon mingle with the learning of Europe, fueling an age that was no longer quite so dark. But at this stage, it was still early morning. The world was only beginning to wake. Imagine walking through a village in the 600s. The air smells of wood smoke and earth. Chickens scatter at your feet. Children chase each other around a small church made of stone and timber. A bell rings, calling everyone to gather. It's not a grand city, not an empire, but it's alive. And that is everything. For people who had grown up hearing stories of the long darkness, every sunrise was sacred. Every harvest felt like a miracle. They didn't need grandeur, they needed peace, and slowly, peace was coming. Yet, rebirth is never without struggle. Old fears still lingered, rumors of famine, of ghosts from the past, of the sky turning dark again. The memory of 536 still haunted the human imagination. It was passed down as a warning. Respect the earth. Fear the cold. Remember the year the sun went away. That memory kept people humble, and maybe that humility was part of why this new world flourished. Humanity had been reminded that it was not the master of nature, but its guest. And guests, when they learn respect, are allowed to stay. So the world grew again, gently, patiently. In the stillness of the countryside, the rhythm of life began to sound like music, a slow, steady song of survival. In that song were the footsteps of farmers, the prayers of monks, the whispers of mothers soothing their children to sleep. Civilization, reborn not in glory, but in grace. This was not yet the Renaissance, not yet the modern world, but it was the heartbeat of what would come. And it began with the simplest truth, that after the darkest night, the world still turns toward dawn. No one from that time could have imagined what their descendants would build. Cathedrals that touched the sky, cities that glowed with light, books that would change how humans understood themselves. But everything that came after began here, in the quiet rebirth of an age that refused to die. The people of the 7th century were not living in history books. They were living in the fragile morning after a storm. And though they didn't know it, the worst was truly behind them. The light had returned, not as a blazing sun, but as a gentle glow, steady enough to guide the world forward. And from that glow, the human story would continue, brightening, deepening, unfolding through the centuries to come. Even after the skies cleared, after the sun shone warm again, the memory of the dark year never truly faded. It lingered in stories, in fears, in the quiet ways people looked at the horizon when clouds began to gather. Generations later, they still whispered about it. The year the world turned cold, when the light went missing and life itself seemed to stop breathing. For those who lived centuries after 536, it was no longer history. It was legend. A story parents told their children beside the hearth on long winter nights. Once, they would say, the sun forgot to rise. The air turned gray, and the world was tested. The children would listen, wide-eyed, watching the flicker of firelight on their parents' faces. Maybe they thought it was just a tale, a warning like so many others. But deep down, something in those words carried truth, as if the earth itself remembered. Human memory is strange. Facts fade, but feelings stay. And the feelings from that lost century, the hunger, the cold, the fear, left marks deeper than history books could ever capture. You can see it in the art of later centuries. Painters began to show the sun as a sacred symbol, not just a source of light but of life itself. Songs spoke of warmth as if it were divine. Even in religion, light and darkness took on new meaning. Heaven was filled with light. Hell was filled with shadow. The world had turned its oldest wound into a language of faith. But memory is not just fear, it's also gratitude. The people who grew up hearing those old stories learned to cherish the simple things. The feel of sunlight on their faces, the sound of birds in the morning, the rhythm of the seasons returning as they should. They didn't take warmth for granted. Every spring felt like a blessing earned. And so the darkness became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a mirror, a reminder of how far humanity had come and how much it could endure. Even centuries later, when scholars began writing down early histories of the world, the year 536 appeared like a shadow in their records. They didn't understand what had caused it, the volcanic eruptions, the dust in the sky, the chain of disasters that followed, but they felt its echo. To them, it was a sign that the world could change without warning, that life could vanish and yet still return. That thought shaped how people saw their place in the universe. It made them humble, it made them reverent, and, in a strange way, it made them hopeful. Because if their ancestors had survived that, then maybe anything was survivable. The memory of the dark also gave birth to stories of balance, of cycles. Myths arose of gods who controlled the seasons, who withdrew light when humanity grew proud, only to return it when they learned humility again. In the north, tales of the long winter were woven into folklore. In the south, stories of eternal sun became dreams of paradise. Even as knowledge advanced, as science began to explain the world, that memory stayed in the corners of the human heart, not as fear, but as wisdom. It taught people that nothing lasts forever, not darkness, not suffering, not even despair. The world always turns. The light always comes back. And perhaps that's why, even now, when we talk about hard times, we still use the same words: a dark year, a long winter, a light at the end of the tunnel. The language of survival, born in 536, still lives on our tongues today. Because deep down, we all carry that same story, the story of losing light and finding it again. For the people of the early medieval world, that memory shaped their faith, their art, and their identity. But for us, it carries something just as powerful: the reminder that even when everything seems lost, the dawn is already on its way. History often focuses on kings and wars, but the real story of the dark year is written in the quiet resilience of ordinary people. Those who endured without understanding, who lit fires against the endless gray and chose stubbornly to live. The world they left behind was not perfect. It was scarred, rebuilt, and fragile, but it was alive, and that was enough. And so, even as the centuries passed and the dark year became myth, the lesson of it remained timeless. No shadow lasts forever. After centuries of darkness, both literal and cultural, the most surprising thing wasn't how slowly humanity recovered, but how naturally curiosity returned. It began in silence, far from cities, in the quiet halls of monasteries and remote villages where people had long ago learned to listen. These early thinkers weren't scientists as we'd call them now. They were monks, healers, stargazers, and scribes, people whose curiosity was wrapped in faith. They didn't separate the divine from the natural. To them, studying the world was a way of understanding God's creation. You can almost imagine them: a candle burning low, a parchment spread across a wooden table, a figure hunched over it, tracing the stars with an ink-stained finger. Outside, the wind howled against stone walls. Inside, there was peace and wonder. They noticed the patterns first: the way the moon changed shape, the rhythm of the seasons, the movement of shadows through the day. They began to record these things, not because anyone told them to, but because they wanted to know. And from that simple desire, the world began to wake up again. Across Europe, from Ireland to Italy, monasteries became quiet islands of knowledge. Each one had a library, a garden, and someone who couldn't help asking questions. They studied herbs for healing, mapped constellations for calendars, and copied old Greek and Roman manuscripts line by line, often without even knowing who the authors were. To them, knowledge wasn't about fame or progress. It was an act of devotion. Every word copied, every observation written, was a small way to keep the world alive. Some monks became fascinated by weather, trying to predict the seasons for planting. Others kept track of eclipses and comets, thinking they might be divine signs. Even when they were wrong, and they often were, they were still searching for truth in a world that had almost forgotten what truth was. In the Middle East, knowledge took on a different shape. Cities like Alexandria, Damascus, and Baghdad became centers of learning once more. Scholars translated ancient Greek works into Arabic, preserving ideas that Europe had nearly lost. Philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy all found refuge there, and slowly, like the rising of a hidden tide, that knowledge began to flow again. Through trade routes, through travelers, through shared stories. It crossed deserts, seas, and mountains until even the farthest monasteries began to feel its pull. The world was still fragile, still half asleep, but curiosity was spreading like the first light of dawn. It's strange to think that all of it, the beginnings of modern science, philosophy, medicine, survived because a handful of people refused to stop wondering. They didn't have laboratories or telescopes. They had patience. They had ink. And they had time. That was enough. From those small rooms of quiet thought, a slow awakening began. Not a revolution, not yet, but the first heartbeat of one. And maybe that's what's most moving about this part of history. For centuries, people had lived in fear of the unknown. The world had punished them before, with famine, with cold, with skies that turned dark for years. But now, instead of fearing nature, they began to study it again. They looked at the world not as an enemy, but as a mystery, something to learn from, not to hide from. And in that gentle shift, from fear to curiosity, humanity rediscovered one of its oldest powers. Because curiosity, more than strength or wealth, is what brings the world back to life. It's what moves a hand to write, an eye to watch, a heart to hope. These hidden scientists weren't trying to change the world. They were simply paying attention. But in doing so, they laid the foundation for the centuries that would follow, for the thinkers, the explorers, and the dreamers who would one day ask even greater questions. The world wasn't fully awake yet, but the lights were flickering on again. One candle, one page, one question at a time. And in that gentle glow, the memory of the dark finally began to fade. By the time the memory of the dark centuries had softened into legend, something remarkable was stirring in the human spirit. A sound so faint at first, yet unmistakable once heard. It was the sound of hope returning. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. Like the hum of bees in spring, or the quiet heartbeat of the earth after winter. For generations, people had lived with fear as their shadow. They had seen the sky darken without warning, watched crops fail, and lost faith in the idea that tomorrow could be better than today. But the world has a way of teaching patience. And now, as sunlight returned to every corner of life, humanity began to dream again. Hope came first in small things, in the laughter of children born after the famine, who would never know a world without light, in the songs sung by travelers walking the reopened trade roads, in the hands of farmers who found joy in planting seeds, not just for survival, but for beauty. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And within those cities, people started to imagine futures that went beyond the next harvest. They built schools, they carved stories into stone, they painted their walls with color again. Every act of creation was a declaration. We are still here. It's easy for us now to look back and see history as a series of grand events, battles, kings, inventions. But the real transformation came from the quiet decisions made by ordinary people. To rebuild, to teach, to share, to trust. Every candle lit against the darkness was part of something larger, a slow, steady awakening of the human heart. Even the way people saw time began to change. The calendar, once just a way to track planting and harvest, became a symbol of progress. Days were no longer just about survival. They became opportunities. People started writing about what could be, not just what was. You could feel it in their art, in the way they carved angels and suns into church doors, in the rhythm of their songs, in the poetry that celebrated not only God, but life itself. They weren't just grateful to have survived. They were beginning to believe that life could be beautiful again. And hope, once it takes root, spreads faster than fear. Merchants carried it along the trade routes. Sailors brought it across the seas. Monks carried it in their manuscripts, explorers in their maps. It wasn't just an idea. It was a feeling that the world was waking up, and maybe, just maybe, the best was still ahead. In the centuries that followed, that feeling would lead to discoveries that changed everything. Science, art, exploration, the Renaissance itself. But in this moment, at the end of the long dark, it was still fragile. It lived quietly, like a song hummed under one's breath. Yet that song mattered, because it meant humanity had learned something profound, that hope doesn't come from power or wealth or even peace. It comes from endurance, from looking at all that's been lost and deciding to begin again anyway. And that's what makes the story of the year 536 and all that followed so deeply human. It's not just about suffering or recovery, it's about rediscovering the courage to believe in tomorrow. When you think about it, hope is a kind of echo, a sound that begins in the past but carries forward, bouncing through time until it reaches us. We still feel it today. Every time we light a candle, start over, or look up at the sunrise and think, it's going to be okay, we are hearing that same echo, the one that began in a world once thought lost. And maybe that's why this story still matters, because no matter how dark things become, there's always someone, somewhere, keeping that small, stubborn flame alive. It doesn't take much light to push back the dark, just enough to see the next step. And humanity, step by step, walked its way out of the longest night in history, guided by that quiet, unwavering sound, the echo of hope. When the world finally emerged from its long shadow, it carried something with it, not just scars, but wisdom. The people who lived through those centuries had learned lessons that would quietly shape everything that came after. They didn't leave behind monuments or great empires. What they left was far more powerful, a way of seeing the world. The first lesson was humility. For centuries, humanity had believed it could command the earth, that it was the master of nature, destined to control the seasons and the skies. But the dark year changed that. When the sun disappeared, when crops failed, when even kings could not summon warmth to their palaces, everyone was reminded of a simple truth. We are guests on this planet, not its rulers. It was a lesson written not in words, but in hunger and cold. And yet, somehow, it brought people closer to the world around them. They began to live with more awareness, more reverence. Farmers studied the soil, learning to read its moods. Sailors watched the stars with new respect. Priests spoke of balance, of harmony, of gratitude for every sunrise. The second lesson was endurance. Even when everything fell apart, when food was scarce, when sickness spread, when families were torn apart, people didn't stop trying. They lit fires against the darkness. They rebuilt homes that had burned. They shared what little they had. And somehow, through all of it, life continued. That endurance became part of the human spirit. Quiet, steady, unshakable. It's the same spirit that later crossed oceans, built cities, and looked toward the stars. It began here in the darkest time, when people learned that survival is not just about strength, but about refusing to give up hope. The third lesson was community. In the face of disaster, isolation means death. But together, people endure. Those who survived did so because they helped one another. Villages shared food. Families took in strangers. Kindness became a form of courage. In a world stripped bare of luxury and comfort, compassion became the greatest wealth. It's easy to forget that now, in a time when the world feels so big and divided. But the people of the 6th century understood something we often overlook. Humanity is strongest when it remembers that we belong to one another. And perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all was this, that even after the worst years imaginable, life can still find its way back to light. The earth healed. The sun returned. Children were born who never knew the darkness their parents had seen. Birds sang again. Crops grew tall. The world began to smile. For the people who had lived through the dark year, that recovery wasn't just a miracle. It was proof. Proof that nothing lasts forever, not even despair. Every spring since then has carried that same truth. No matter how cold the winter, the world always finds a way to bloom again. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, that we too are part of that cycle. We fall, we rise, we break, we heal, we lose the light, and then we find it again. Over and over, for as long as we exist. When you think about it, the year 536 wasn't just the worst year to be alive. It was also the year that tested what being alive truly meant. It asked humanity one question: will you give up? And humanity answered no. That answer still echoes through time, in every generation that faces its own darkness. Because the lessons of that long winter were never really forgotten. They became part of us, quiet, instinctive, passed down not in words, but in the way we keep going, no matter what. The people of that age are gone. Their names are lost. But their strength lives on. In every act of rebuilding, every moment of kindness, every spark of hope that refuses to die. They taught us how to endure, how to rebuild, how to believe in dawn again. And maybe that's all history ever really is. The story of light returning again and again. When the darkness finally lifted, the world felt new. Not completely healed, not yet, but alive again. For the first time in generations, people looked to the horizon and saw more than fear. They saw color, they saw promise, they saw a future waiting to be written. The year 536 had tested the limits of what it meant to be human. It stripped life down to its most fragile form and asked, again and again, whether the light was worth waiting for. And humanity, against every odd, had waited. By the time the skies turned blue again, everything had changed. Not just the earth, but the way people saw it. They had learned that nothing could be taken for granted. The warmth of the sun, the taste of bread, the laughter of a neighbor, each was a miracle in its own quiet way. And so began what historians now call the Long Dawn, the slow, tender return of a life and color to the world. It wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a gentle one, like the sunrise that creeps inch by inch across a frozen field. The warmth didn't come in one day, but in small moments that built upon one another until one morning, people realized they weren't afraid anymore. The farmers returned to their fields. The forests began to breathe again. The seas, once choked with ash, sparkled under a forgiving sun. And across the continents, humanity took its first steps toward rebuilding not just homes, but hope. That hope became the seed for centuries of progress. The lessons learned in the dark would guide everything that came after. The rediscovery of knowledge, the rise of art, the birth of science, the growth of faith and reason side by side. Out of suffering, a strange kind of beauty grew. When you look at the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, the illuminated manuscripts, the songs, and poems that survived, you can almost feel it. That quiet reverence for the light. Every golden halo painted around a saint's head, every sunrise described in ancient verse, carries the echo of those who once lived without it. The Long Dawn wasn't just about light returning to the world. It was about meaning returning, too. Humanity began to believe again, not just in gods or kings, but in itself. The same species that had nearly vanished into cold and shadow had risen once more, not through conquest, but through endurance. And perhaps that is what makes the story of the dark year so haunting and so comforting. It reminds us that no matter how deep the darkness, it never lasts forever. Every ending carries the beginning of light within it. Every winter holds the seed of spring. Every silence hides the whisper of a new song. The people of 536 could not have known what would come after them. The great empires, the discoveries, the art, the flight to the stars. But in some quiet, unspoken way, they made it all possible, because they proved that the light always returns. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine standing on a quiet hill at the edge of that ancient world. The air is cool, still carrying traces of the long winter. But in the distance, the sky is turning gold. The first birds are singing. The frost is melting. And the world, against all odds, is alive. Maybe that's all we ever need to remember, that no matter what happens, the dawn always comes. And so our story ends where it began, with the sun rising once more. And so our journey through the shadow of the year 536 and the long dawn that followed comes to an end. We've walked through the darkness, through cold skies and silent harvests, through centuries of fear and struggle. But we've also seen how even in the darkest of ages, humanity never truly gives up. It bends, it breaks, it falls, but it always finds the strength to rise again. The story of the worst year to be alive isn't just about despair. It's about endurance. It's about faith, not only in gods or kings, but in the simple, stubborn will to keep going. It reminds us that even when the sun disappears, the light isn't gone forever. It's only waiting, just beyond the clouds, for us to find it again. And maybe that is the secret that every age must learn in its own way, that darkness doesn't end in an instant. It fades slowly, as hearts heal, as voices return, as hope gathers again, one person at a time. The people of 536 didn't know they were living through history. They didn't have books or cameras or words to describe what they felt, but their survival became our inheritance. A reminder written not on paper, but in the rhythm of who we are. Because every time we face our own storms, every time we keep walking when the night feels endless, we echo their strength. We continue their story. So tonight, as you rest, remember this. The light always returns. The world always heals. And sometimes, even the longest night in history ends with the softest sunrise. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through time with me. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, gentle tales from history, told slow and soft to help you rest, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell. It helps this little corner of peace reach others who might need it too. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and may the light of history guide you through the dark.